Hey guys, it's BenTbeyondrepair here. I don't know if everybody knows this, but I'm actually pretty heavily involved, or had been at different points in the NA amateur scene. Especially, I worked as an analyst when I was in high school for Zenith Esports, which was a team that was trying to play in the open qualifier to get into the Challenger Series. And I actually ended up fielding my own roster many years later, probably about a year ago now, for one of the open qualifiers when they started those back up again. So as someone who's been involved with working with NA players and trying to develop NA talent, this is an issue that hits pretty close to home. I want to talk about why NA is performing so poorly at Worlds, and one of the things that really frustrates me about what we're doing, and but also talk about some real practical issues that aren't super easy to solve, that just are inherently true. So let's start off by talking about why NA is underperforming Korea, China, and Europe. There is one reason that is just predominant, and the main reason, and it's not very easy to overcome. We actually just mentioned this in the video complaining about how many splits there were, and how hard it is to continue to play the game when Riot is essentially making it take up so much time. But essentially the problem is that it's a player base problem. In NA, and we're only, 6-7 days into the start of the split, so take these numbers with a grain of salt, but they do seem to be lining up and tracking with what I've seen before, even towards the end of the split. You can see that so far 278,000 accounts have been placed in NA, yet if you go to Korea, there are 726,000 accounts that have been placed. If you go to Europe, there are 653,000 accounts, and of course you've also got Europe, Nordic East, and some of those players are going to funnel into the system as well. And so part of the issue here, and China's obviously got more players than any of these regions as well. It's just not possible to see China on op.gg because they don't have one server. They have like 30 different servers, and they kind of operate a little bit differently, and so they're not quite as publicly available like the Korea and NA ones and stuff are. But nevertheless, the point is that the regions that have the most players are China and Korea. And Europe is not too far behind. And so in these regions, obviously there are enough players to support a very healthy pool of players. I did mention this in the last video, but we'll go through it again. But if we take a look at overlapping normal distributions, what we can see in these pictures is that if you have, like in yellow, one region, let's say NA, and in green, a region like Korea, even if the averages aren't very different, like the distance from this average to this average is from here to here. Think about where you have to go if you're a professional player. For NA, the professional players are being drawn from this tail end of the NA distribution down here. So maybe, you become a pro player if you're, roughly speaking, better than this piece of the distribution, this very skinny tail end of the distribution. Well, if you're at that level in Korea, you're just never becoming a pro player in Korea. In fact, you would have to go out past what this picture shows to the tail end of the Korean distribution, because there's so many players here who are still, as good as the best player in NA, that essentially what you end up with is, every Korean pro is better than every homegrown NA pro from the NA solo queue ladder. That's just kind of the reality, is that even if there's a very small difference in average, at the extreme ends of the distribution, you're going to get extreme differences in the result. So rather than one player being this good, and that's like the best NA talent that there is, there's going to be like 20, 30 Korean players that are like that. So obviously even the worst Korean pro player is going to be better than 90% of NA pro players. That's just kind of the reality of having more people And so having a better average. Why is it that the average is better? It's like we talked about this before, it's just a bigger pool of people. If you have a high school with 10,000 people and they're putting a football team together, their football team is going to be a hell of a lot better than a high school with 1,000 people, because if you pick your 50 best football players out of 10,000 people, they're going to be a lot better 50 players than if you pick your 50 players out of 1,000 people. Just that simple, right? So that's the reality of the situation. This is the number one problem that is contributing to NA being behind other regions, is there's just not that many players. I even mentioned before that you can even look and compare it to a region like Brazil or whatever, and there's nearly as many people in Brazil playing solo queue as there are in NA. Even in Latin America, there are less here, but if you add up Latin America North and Latin America South, which are two separate servers but operate even currently as the same region in terms of competitive play, there's actually similar number to NA and to Brazil in Latin America. So obviously NA is more on par in terms of player count with a Brazil or a Latin America than it is with a Korea or a Europe or a China. That's just the reality of the situation. Second problem, Korea is a very small country, and because it is a very small country, we're talking about physical landmass, because it's a very small country, most players are playing on very low ping. It's also a very urban country, and so there are a lot of people who are living within very close proximity to the city that the server is in. And so most Koreans playing solo queue are playing on a much lower average ping than NA players are. And even for Europe, it is going to be better than it is for NA, but Europe is going to have comparatively some problems with ping. And China is also going to have an advantage here because, well, China is also a large country. Because they have like 30 different servers, like we mentioned, they're going to get to play on a server that is close enough to them that they will be playing on good ping. And so as a result, you end up with a situation where, let's say the average ping, we don't know exactly what the number is, but just to throw some hypotheticals out there, the average Korean player is probably playing on like 12 or 13 ping, maybe even less. The average NA player is probably playing on like 40 or 50 ping. So the problem with that is that League is actually, and I can tell you this as a high elo player, League is a very different game when you're playing at 50 or 60 ping versus when you're playing at like 10 ping. And especially 10 ping even compared to like lower. It's crazy. So I've had the experience of playing in Seattle. We've talked about this before, when the server was in California. And when the server was in California, I was playing on 20 ping. Then they moved the server to Chicago. And when they moved the server to Chicago, I was then stuck playing on 60 ping. Then I moved to college in the Midwest near the server. And because I was near the server, I had like something like 13, 14 ping. And then at one point I even had 4 ping. And then I had, now I have about 13 ping again, whatever. So that's a really interesting experience because I can tell you what playing the game is like on 60 ping. And I can tell you what playing the game is like on 4 ping. And it is a world of difference. When you play League, especially at a high level, ability interactions are really key. In fact, when I talk about how to get better at League, I really break it up into number 1, learn what all the abilities in the game are. And then number 2, that would be something you do when you're in like bronze and silver. And then number 2, as you get higher up, you learn how abilities interact with each other and how you can best use your ability to like maximize its value, like using Braum E to cancel Ornn R, those kind of interactions. There are many more of them. There's like 700,000 or something like that because actually I forget the number, but there's like, there's like 700 abilities and passives in the game, and each one of them interacts with each other one in a different way. And so there's up to 700 raised to the power of 2, 700 times 700, something ridiculous number, number of combinations of how abilities can interact with each other. It's too many for one person to ever learn. So League gets really complicated as a game the higher up you go because your ability to execute the game properly at a high level depends on, hey, do you know how your champion's abilities interact with all of the other abilities in the game? And can you do that on 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different champions so that you can be really, a really outstanding player with a good champion pool and mastery over that champion completely, and then execute on that knowledge. So it's very difficult, right? The problem is that when you go to learn, okay, does Gragas E stop Jarvan EQ, and you're playing on 60, 70 ping, your understanding of, is it worth it for me to even try to practice using the ability this way when I am not possibly going to have the reaction time or be able to time this correctly in order to get it off? You're going to use your abilities in a completely different way and learn how to play the game and learn how your abilities interact a completely different way, because you don't have the speed and the ping to be able to use the ability properly. So you're not even going to bother trying to use your E on Gragas to cancel the Jarvan EQ. You're just going to use your E in some other way before he EQs you or something like that, because it's too high risk actually for you to try to use your E to cancel his ability. But at a high level, or if you were playing in competitive or something like that, and you were competing with like the best Korean players in the world, well, you better bet that you can't just get away with using your ability that way. You have to maximize the value that you're getting from it. And if you learned how all these abilities interact with each other in kind of an improper way, well, then when you get into competitive and you start scrimming on LAN, or you start scrimming on the tournament realm, or you move out to California, is it any wonder that solo queue players in NA are less likely to translate into high quality competitive players when they've learned the game all wrong? And so it's a miracle that certain players even can get to Challenger on that kind of ping. And the other reality, which is pretty harsh, is that because of this ping advantage, a lot of players who get to the top of Challenger are people who live near Chicago now. And it used to be the case back in like the old Bay Life TSM days in season 2, 3, 4, whatever. All the pro players were coming out of SoCal. They were all coming out of California. Well, why is that? Sort of, maybe you could argue it's partially the culture there, that like they were getting into League in that area, but it probably had a lot to do with the server being there, right? Especially in the early days when like the hardware was bad and every player was playing on 2 FPS on a toaster and basically lagging like crazy. Having, 1 ping or whatever because you lived in SoCal was probably a massive advantage over some guy in the East Coast playing on 130 ping trying to play the game they don't even understand yet. So, and now you see a lot more pro players coming out of the Midwest. So this is another big issue, is that when you have a wider, larger country where the server, even if you stick it in the middle, the average player is playing on so much ping that they're not even learning how to play the game properly. So you have both a player-based problem in terms of not enough people playing the game. You also have a ping issue, right? And now let's get into the final nail in the coffin for the region, which is another big factor, which is, frankly, there aren't very many NA players getting the opportunity to play professionally in the league and to get coaching and to get the kind of help or to be able to make a living or a career out of playing in NA, because we're importing 40% of the league from Korea because of these other factors that we talked about, because the Korean players, look like they're more developed, refined players because they were able to learn the game on really high quality ping, and because they were, coming out of a more competitive solo queue environment where those people who hit Challenger in Korea are much likely to be better than someone who hit Challenger in NA, or maybe they've even posted results in Korea in the LCK or whatever. And so as a result, right, they just started importing a lot of people. And this is one of the things that's frustrated me the most, is if you're going to have a system for League of Legends where the whole point of competitive play is to showcase one region versus another, why would you allow players from one region to play in another region representing that other region versus themselves? It doesn't make any sense. And this really culminated with a couple of events, specifically LMQ back in season 4 coming over to the NALCS. If you don't know the history of LMQ, LMQ was an all Chinese team that was literally like, I don't know, like a sixth place team in China, and they literally just came into the LCS, won promotion into the LCS, and then ended up getting third by like one game or something like that, and taking a world spot away from NA in season 4, and they just got to be another Chinese team at Worlds. As a result, Riot made a rule after that saying that you could only have 2 imports per team, but they doctored into this arrangement all of the players who were imports in NA who were currently already there, including all of LMQ, so that those players were essentially grandfathered in. So players at that time, like Bjergsen, or maybe Jensen was here, I don't remember, but players like Bjergsen and Jensen who had come to NA at that point already were essentially fathered into this system so that they counted as residents of NA, even though they had only been here for like a year or two. And all of LMQ, which was literally the team that was abusing this. Luckily, Zhao Weizhao, their mid laner, was banned for like elo boosting accounts or something like that, and the team ended up disbanding anyways. And so those players didn't end up coming back and playing in the NALCS, but they could have. Now, on top of this, so you have this shenanigans, right? So Riot makes this rule: you can have up to 2 imports, but no more than that. As a result, a lot of teams start feeling pressured to make use of the 2 imports because, well, if teams that are trying to win and the best teams in the region and the teams with money to import really good players are going to use this to the max, and they're going to import 2 really good Korean players or whatever to their team, we better do the same, otherwise we're going to be at a disadvantage. And so a lot of teams just imported a ton of Korean players into NA. Well, there were other things about this as well that were kind of ridiculous. Like, for example, if a player, had played long enough, if they had been here for a couple of years, if they got residency and stuff like that, then they could become a permanent NA resident instead of counting as an import. And so a lot of players, after years of playing in NA, like Impact and other players and stuff like that, basically got NA residency, and so they no longer counted towards the import slot. Well, now that team can go and import 2 new Korean players, but still have a third Korean player in like Impact playing top lane because he was, had earned his residency status after a number of years, and so he could play. And so now you could have 3. You also have a situation where when the Oceanic League was disbanded for the first time, I think it's happened twice now, but I don't really know the history of Oceanic League of Legends. But when the Oceanic League blew up, there was an attempt to save some of those players' careers. And so all of the Oceanic players were given residency in NA. Players like Fudge, players like Ayla, FBI are able to play in NA because they were just arbitrarily, randomly given residency status. And so rather than counting as an import slot where you could, import a Korean player instead of them, you can have this, Fudge from Oceania, or you could have FBI, or you could have Ayla or whatever, and you could have these players on your team who are basically an import, but you could also have 2 Korean imports, and you could also have, some grandfathered in Korean player who had been playing in NA for a little while. So when you start to look at the list of who has NA residency status, let's see if we can find this. As a NA residency Wikipedia, let's see if we can find this. Okay, so here it is for NA. This is a list I like to take a look at every once in a while. It's kind of ridiculous. So obviously, here were the initial players that were selected for residency: Amazing, Bjergsen, Dexter, Helios, Keen, Crepo, Lustboy, Quas, Santorin, Seraph, Zhao Zhao, and Chaox. So these were the people who had basically been playing in NA, but weren't going to count as imports because they had been playing in NA before the import rule went into effect. Then these are the players who have been playing in NA for long enough to earn permanent residency. Huhi, Someday, Arrow, Gamsu, Core JJ, Power of Evil, Sven, and Inspired. Then residency via IMP. I don't know what this means. Maybe through immigration proceedings. It wouldn't be through import, but either way, these players managed to get residency as well, pretty similar to the permanent residency thing. So Impact, Piglet, Jensen, Phoenix, Svenskeren, Huni. And then, of course, like I just mentioned, all of these Oceanic players got residency as well because they wanted them to potentially be able to come into NA if they were good enough when their league imploded. So all of these players, including some that we know, Ayla, who played for 100 Thieves or is playing for 100 Thieves, FBI, Fudge, so all of these players were given residency status as well. This is an interesting one. Maybe I'm confusing him with a different Ryoma, but I thought there was a Korean Ryoma, but maybe we're thinking of different players. Either way, it doesn't matter. So obviously all these players were given residency, so it's quite a bit. And then there's also some players who it looks like will gain future eligibility. So it's just mentioning that all of these players are retired. But yeah, either way. And then you can see that in Europe, the only people who are given residency in Europe are literally the original, like Moscow 5 or Gambit members who had been playing in the EU LCS but were technically from Russia. Or from the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. One guy who was formerly eligible but is no longer eligible from Korea. And yeah, that's it for Europe. And then in Brazil, there's one guy from EU who was formerly eligible but is no longer eligible. There were the Korean players that went to China. And there were a couple of EU players that got residency in the Commonwealth of Independent States, like Edward from Moscow 5, and then some Korean players in Japan. But obviously, NA by far has way more players that were given residency. And again, this isn't even including the 2 players per team that can actually just be straight imports. These are all of the import players that don't count as imports. So you can obviously, as I was saying, I said, you can go look, there's a video complaining about this. I said, looking at how long this list is and how many Korean players there are, it's only going to be a matter of time before someone takes a look at this list and gets to a point where they just put a 5-man Korean roster together in NA. They get 2 new Korean players, 3 old Korean players from the list. They slap a roster together and they just go to Worlds as Korea's 4th or 5th seed. And lo and behold, Team Liquid actually did that for a split, and they managed to put like a 5-man Korean roster together. And fortunately, it actually didn't work out that well for them, and they didn't do that well. But it was just nuts, because essentially, with Riot allowing all of these imported players, they had a second LMQ situation occurring in the LCS. Just luckily, they didn't end up being very good, and then they added their 1 or 2 NA players back to the roster. But the point is that this is ridiculous, right? So now, if we look at a team that just underperformed very heavily at Worlds, which is actually what the topic of the video is supposed to be about, 100 Thieves. So when you look at 100 Thieves, River and Quid are both Korean, and Ayla is from Oceania. So we only have 2 players who are from the United States or Canada, who are actually from NA, playing on the team. The AD carry, Tomo, and G Snipes in the top lane. So that's it. And this is the case for most of the NA teams. And I actually wanted to take a look and go back and look at some previous worlds, because I believe if we go back and look at worlds, like here we are, the 2024 World Championship. Let's see if we can see. I think we can see somewhere here how many NA players are actually playing in the event. I actually don't see the option to see it. Usually it's down here at the bottom. Maybe it's in a different spot. Well, let's go back and look. Yeah, what happened to this? Okay, so we can see here, for example, for some reason they're not even showing it for 2024, but we can go back and we can look at 2023. I mean, there's only 3 teams to look at from NA. Actually, only 2 made it to the group stage, but I mean, we should count the one that made it to the play-ins too. But we can take a look at how many players actually come from North America, and we can see that only what is it here? From America, there were only 9 players. Is actually more than I expected. Plus you've got Canada. So there were only 9 players from North America that were playing in the World Championship. And then how many from Canada? This is kind of confusing. I don't see Canada here at all. Am I blind? Country of birth. Am I missing something? When did we make it to the quarterfinals of Worlds? We made it to the quarterfinals in 2023? I must be missing something. None of this seems right. Oh yeah, Energy actually did make it to the quarterfinals. Okay. So NRG saved it a little bit in 2023, but just to go back and look, to keep in mind, out of 3 teams, and what would that be? Out of 3 teams, and maybe 2022 was worse. Out of 3 teams that went to Worlds from NA in 2023, which would be 15 players, only 9 of them were born in the United States. Apparently none born in Canada. So we're talking about 9 players. Maybe this is including subs or something like that. I can't imagine it was actually this high, because I'm pretty sure in 2022 it was literally 3 out of 15. So let's go back and look at this. Maybe we'll get an idea here. Yeah, they're counting subs or something. Oh, no, they're not, because here we have 2. Okay, so maybe it was different because NRG managed to qualify in 2023, but in 2022 at Worlds, there were literally only 2 NA players. Let's see if we can see for this year yet. Yeah, there were 5, and obviously, a bunch didn't qualify because of Well, yeah, we know 2 on 100 Thieves didn't qualify, so we're down from 5 to 3 now in the Swiss stage. So you get my point, right? I guess 2023 was a nice fluke where we actually had 9 NA players. But in 2024, we had what, 5 NA players out of 15. Then we had 9 out of 15 in 2023. And then we had 3 out of 15 in 2022. And keep in mind, by the way, that look at the results of NA at Worlds. Now, we don't know the results yet this year, but NA in 2022 didn't make it to, can we see? I don't believe they made it to quarterfinals. Yeah, they were. This was like the year they went something like I want to say 3-17 or something terrible. Or maybe that wasn't this year, but so NA didn't even make it to quarterfinals. The one year where we actually have 9 NA players, the team does make it to quarterfinals. And then I guess we don't know, obviously, if any teams from NA are going to make it to quarterfinals this year. But I will tell you that the only team I picked for Pick'ems to make it is maybe FlyQuest makes it to quarterfinals, and I'm not optimistic about that. Like, I think that their chances of making quarterfinals are probably less than 50%, but they're there. They're 40% or 45%. Like they have a decent shot of making quarterfinals, probably around 50% or so. But we'll see. So we've got what? We've got 5 this time, and then in 2022, when we only had 3 NA players, we didn't get out at all of groups. What about in 2021? In 2021, there were 5 American players and 1 Canadian player. So we had 6. I guess I probably skipped the Canadian players, but you get the point. Basically, my problem is, and you can dive into the numbers if you really want to, my problem is that if you're going to set up the whole international system to be about how does NA stack up against Korea, but then 3 NA players go to Worlds or 5 NA players go to Worlds, and then NA gets destroyed anyways, it feels bad because the people representing our region aren't actual players or talent from our region. They didn't come out of our Seleucid ladder. They aren't like born in North America. They're just like random people who are like mercenaries hired to play for our teams, and then they're not even doing well. So when you look at 100 Thieves, obviously he's going to get a lot of criticism for this one game. You have an imported player like Quid who goes 0-8 on Vex in game 3 of the series, and why, as an NA player, are you going to be happy with the fact that rather than a true representative NA team going to Worlds, we instead got to watch Quid go 0-8? Like, okay, so some third-rate Korean player that they managed to import into NA is losing to other Korean players, by the way, on like R7 and stuff like that, because R7 also had 2 Korean solo laners, by the way. So they have a Summit, and I forget the other guy's name, but he was also Korean. Kiaya or something like that. What was his name? Should show in 100 Thieves match history that they just lost to. Where's R7? But obviously you get the point. Like, we're not actually getting to see how NA players stack up internationally ever. Not only are there few international events, but at the few international, it started with a K. Keen, it's like a scuffed keen, a Kiene. I butchered his name. It is what it is. I would have been better off not looking it up. You get what I'm saying, right? Like, okay, so what is the point of having the whole international system set up like this? You barely have any international play at all, and when you do have international play, it's like, okay, there's 1 Canadian and like 2 or 3 NA players playing, or American players playing, right? It's like, at least if we're going to go to Worlds and lose, right? Can you show me what it would actually look like to see a team of 5 NA players actually go and lose to the Koreans? Because as far as I can tell, we're just importing some Korean players who in a lot of cases aren't playing better than NA players. And this is going to be a hot take because a lot of people will say, well, you've just started out by pointing out how there's a lot less players on the NA solo queue ladder and how poaching these people from Korean solo queue or from Korean Academy and stuff like that probably helps to balance things out and should actually make NA better by importing some of those quality players to the region. Sort of true. Problem, however, is that many of those players are coming to NA not with the expectation to compete or to win a championship or to go to Worlds and win Worlds. They're coming to NA because it's easy money, right? They're going to make a lot more than they would make playing Academy or playing for some third-rate team in Korea, if they ever even get a chance to do that over there. And so they get to make more money, and they don't have to perform that well because there's no expectation that they do well. At least not really, right? Like they just have to perform like half decently. Maybe not even that. I mean, I wouldn't call going 0-8 and locking in Vex half decently. I would call that a complete paycheck thief, a complete, just like waste of an opportunity for, the last time we had a third seed from NA going to Worlds. Obviously, next year we're losing a world spot to Brazil and combining with like Brazil and Latin America as a league. So it looks like the way it's panning out, there will be like, 2 NA teams and 1 Brazilian team going. It could go all kinds of different ways. There's 2 Latin American teams on each side, so technically it could be like a Latin American team getting 2 world spots, and all kinds of other things like that. So there's lots of different scenarios that can happen, but the expectation would be that NA will get 2 teams to go to Worlds, and Brazil's kind of guaranteed one because there's not an NA team on the other side of the bracket, and that side of the bracket is, or that side of the league is guaranteed a world spot. So the issue here is that we never really got to see many NA teams, if ever, actually go into Worlds and compete internationally versus the other regions. There's not very much international play to begin with. And the Koreans who are coming over here and playing, I mean, look at the history of them. I mean, we go down this list. It's not like these guys played that well, which is kind of the crazy thing. Is like, you look at a lot of the Koreans that came over here, and a lot of them did not do well. You look at a player like Piglet or something who came over here as a world champion, expected to perform incredibly well, and kind of carry the region and form some crazy super team. And he was literally like, couldn't be bothered, and was like sitting in his bed saying that he wanted to play for the Academy team, famously on, you can see it in the Breaking Point thing about Team Liquid from a long time ago. These players come over and they know that their career is over, or that their career is just starting, and it's a way for them to make a name for themselves while making good money. And they're essentially just here to get the paycheck and perform decently well to continue getting a paycheck and then go home. And the solo queue environment sucks compared to Korea. So they're not that interested in practicing solo queue here or playing in solo queue here. And the NA players are having to deal with multilingual teams who can't speak English and don't understand what they're saying or communicating. And the one strength that you might have as a smaller region, which is, let's say that you get to be really creative, maybe you come up with some creative team comps and things like that in order to make up for some of the deficit that you have to a region like Korea. Like, I would say in general, one of the advantages that a region like NA, but EU as well, have compared to a region like Korea or China is that NA is very, very innovative when it comes to metas and strategies. Whereas the Koreans, especially even in their solo queue, play a very meta-driven, rigid game. I'll just give one quick example because this is kind of a claim, right, that doesn't have a whole lot of evidence, but I'll just give an example. If you look at like the pick rate of let's, look at just, we can look at all champions. If we look at like pick rates in NA for, let's look at support, right? So like the highest pick rate support right now is Lulu with like a 14% pick rate. So we've got like 14%, 12%, 12%, 10%, 10%. So just remember that. Now, if we flip over to Korea, these numbers are going to be a lot higher. Yeah, so we see it's like 14, 14, 13, 12, 10, almost 10. This isn't even that bad compared to what it usually is. We can look at other roles, like AD carry tends to be a pretty rigid one. We're seeing like 38%, 36% even in NA, and then 18. Oh, this is in Korea, I mean. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, we flip back to NA, it's much lower. So what is going on here, right? You can see that even in solo queue, even just in Emerald Plus, Korea sticks to a meta and plays meta champions much more than other regions and much, much more than NA. So it may even be more drastic at like the bottom. So like, let's say an 80 carry is a bad one to look at for like the least picked champions, I guess. Maybe support is too, because so many random things. So we have like, well, let's look at this instead of the pick rate. How many support champions do they even have enough data on? 46 support champions. I bet if we go to Korea, there won't be as many support champions. Oh no, they're keeping all 46. So it's not based on how many games are being played. These champions are being thrown into a pool. So that's not super helpful to look at. What about like the bottom pick rates? But you get the idea. I mean, maybe you can see it better than in the most picked champions, but Korea sticks to a meta. So I've said before, if you want to win and you have players that aren't as good, how do you win? Right? You need to actually accept reality as a region. Accept that you're not going to be as good mechanically as players who've been practicing for 12 years on 8 ping. When you've been sitting in Texas playing on 60 ping, you're not going to be as good as the Korean players mechanically. And they have too many people compared to us playing the game. And so you're probably just straight up not going to be as good at the game as them either. So how do you win versus an opponent that is better than you in a game like League? There are some solutions here. You be creative and change the way that the game is played so much that they don't know what game they're playing anymore. And now it comes down to their adaptability and how good they are at adapting to what you're doing and the way that you're creating the game on the fly, which they're not good at doing because they're playing against the same champions, the same meta over and over and over again, very rigidly following a meta. So now you throw a champion into a series versus a Korean team that they're never used to playing against, that they've never laned against in that role, and now you have an advantage. The other thing is that the longer the game goes on, the more chance there is for a better team to have time to have made the plays or found the consistent plays that are going to slowly choke you out of a game. So you need to do better earlier. This is a little bit difficult because scaling champions are so darn good in League right now, and it's so hard to play early game comps. But one of the strategies that was very successful when Vietnam was first becoming really good internationally for like Gigabyte Marines and stuff like that is they were playing like Lee Sin and Nocturne in the jungle a lot and over again, back to back. Why was that so successful for them? I believe one of the reasons why it was really successful for them was because they were playing very strong early game champions that they could just execute well enough to get a lead versus a team that wasn't used to playing the game that fast paced and fighting at an early enough stage into the game where the other team hadn't had a chance to make consistent plays yet against them to get ahead. And so they were fighting on an even playing field. That is something that NA teams need to do. Even when you look at like, what was their name? The team from the CIS that did really well at Worlds, Dark Passage. Dark Passage played a lot of off-meta picks. They were playing Anivia mid when no one was playing Anivia mid. They were combining Anivia mid with like Poppy and stuff like that so they could Poppy E into the Anivia wall, like really just out there creative stuff. brand support, which nobody was playing. They were just picking champions that nobody else was playing and throwing teams off, partially because they were playing champions that no one was practicing against, no one was scrimming against, and no one was thinking about how to play the matchups. And so they found their edge that way. Gigabyte Marines, like I said back in the day, definitely took advantage of teams like TSM and other teams because of the fact that they were playing a very aggressive, very strong early game strategy that they had been honing really well, that some of these teams weren't used to playing against such a fast-paced team, and they were able to get fights in early and essentially cheese their way to victory before the other team had a chance to make slow, consistent plays to get ahead of them. I mean, just think about it like if you were playing a solo queue game and you were playing versus a diamond player and you're a gold player, how would you go about beating that team? You've got to like invade level 1, you've got to try to cheese them, you've got to try to throw them off their game and play some off meta champions they're not used to playing against but that you main or have practiced a lot to prepare for the match. Like that's what you would do, right? So do that and throw the teams off. Make a strategy that is based on the reality of the situation and execute well on that. But essentially to cap things off, 100 Thieves did pretty poorly at Worlds and got eliminated in the play-ins. But we have to keep in mind that 3 out of the 5 players aren't NA players. I know that sounds like copium, and it is a little bit of copium. I'm not saying that NA is good, right? Obviously, like we've just been through, NA has the player base of a Brazil or a Latin America. It's not really expected. I guess it is expected, but it shouldn't be expected that they would somehow perform as well as Korea, China, or EU. And the player base in NA has actually been declining as well in a way that hasn't really been in other regions. Obviously, Brazil and Latin America and other smaller regions are growing. Japan, Middle East server dropped. These smaller regions are growing. And in Korea and in Europe, it's at least stable. And in China, it's still growing, and they're already like the biggest region. So obviously, the expectation that NA would be able to continue to perform like a major region is basically a false expectation. But the reality is that we haven't gotten to see a whole lot of NA players at Worlds in the first place, and I think that's disappointing because of the whole point of the international system is to allow these, inter-regional rivalries and competition. If we don't actually get to see what 5 NA players look like going up to Worlds, and instead we see like 2 NA players surrounded by like some Australian guy and 2 Korean players, and they're having communication issues and half the team is sandbagging it and just kind of getting their paycheck and retiring to NA, or taking the opportunity to make a lot of money at the start of a career that may or may not work out in Korea instead of playing in academy. Obviously, you're not going to get the highest quality result. You may have been better off actually developing NA talent. And then, of course, right, with the already low bar that we're starting with NA players coming out of a lower populated solo queue and a higher ping environment, you obviously need to make up for those gaps in higher quality training, right? But if you're not giving NA players the opportunity to play for LCS teams because there aren't as many LCS teams and 40% of the slots are going to imports, plus all of the imports that don't count as imports like we went through, so maybe 50% of the players in the league aren't from NA, well, all of the sudden, can we really even say it's the NA LCS playing? It's like we've got Korea, we've got China, we've got Brazil, and we've got Latin America, but then Brazil and Latin America actually have a bunch of Korean players too, but it's like really what we've got in NA is like a multi-region, like, mix of players. And so it's really weird. But yeah, obviously the point is that if you're going to deny NA players the opportunity to gain experience at Worlds over the past 10 years, and you're going to deny them the opportunity to have a career where they can spend more time practicing and scrimming and stuff like that, obviously there aren't going to be as many good players anyways. To go back to that distribution we were looking at, Let's see if we can pull that up. Yeah, to go back to this distribution that we were looking at, imagine the difference between, okay, we take these top 50 players, these red dots down here, right? And we allow all of these top 50 players from NA, I'm blocking the thing. You know, there's these little dots here, like each individual people at the tail end of the distribution. If we allow these 50 players to all play a professional career where they get to spend 10 hours a day practicing the game, and, you know, a handful of them get to go to Worlds and gain years and years of experience at Worlds, that's going to make a world of difference compared to, well, actually half of these guys don't even get to play professionally because we're just going to import these green Korean solo queue players or academy players or retiring pros. So it's just terrible. I mean, yeah, it's just no good. So obviously that's frustrating. We'll see how things go next year, since we're also going to be down a world spot, which means even less experience, et cetera, but it's probably deserved at this point. It's just really frustrating that the region is declining like this, and we never really even got to play ourselves, right? Like, we never got to represent ourselves. We never had that many NA players actually playing professionally and playing at Worlds. And so I think the whole thing has been kind of a bit of a sham as far as like actually comparing NA players to EU players or to Korean players or whatever. Hopefully Riot gets rid of the imported players, but obviously they're not going to do that. They feel like the best way to help NA be competitive on the international stage is to, well, turn half of the whole region into imported players, by, you know, combining it with Brazil and Latin America. So that is an interesting route to take. They had actually even discussed for this year increasing the import limit from 2 to 3. I made a video about that, but it looks like obviously that never happened. So I think, but that was official. You know, really trustworthy sources were saying that. So I think that they decided against that. You know, they won't reverse course though. They really feel like, you know, to keep NA competitive, better to have 3 Korean players on the team and 2 NA players so that they have a better chance of winning. I don't think it's actually working, but we'll see. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.